I have the intro slide.
Hello, everyone. We're back at Hack Summit. Thanks for tuning in. And we're joined now by Brian Fox, who is the co-founder of the Orchid Protocol. And Brian Fox actually holds the record. He is the only speaker at Hack Summit who has spoken at all 3 events that we've held because we love him so much, and he's such an awesome guy to chat with. You're just gonna love this guy's energy. He's amazing. And we're gonna have a great conversation about Orchid, but just a little bit more about Brian and his background. So he's a developer himself, but he's also an entrepreneur and he's a consultant. And he's an advocate of free software. So I don't know if you guys know this, but he actually was the original author of the GNU Bash shell back in the day. And he's built the first online banking software for Wells Fargo. He also had the chance to collaborate with Richard Stallman. Back in 1985, he was the first employee of the Free Software Foundation. And he also authored the Bash shell, which is widely used in most modern versions of various flavors of Unix, as well as GNU Finger, and he contributed to GGB and Emacs. So he's an amazing open source contributor, and now he's helping us with the next generation privacy layer to help us with security on the blockchain. Brian, thanks so much for being here with us today.
It's a pleasure to be here, Ed.
Awesome. And by the way, Brian also has a guitar with him, so he may be playing for us later if I can talk him into it. He's an incredible musician, as I've recently learned. So, Brian, it's great to see you again. Thanks for being with us here. Maybe you can fill the audience in a little bit about yourself and your background, how you got started programming, what got you into open source originally, and how you think about open source.
Right. Okay. Well, let me start by just kind of sharing this one slide with you here. This is kind of my existence. The world started for me back in 1960 or so, and I don't know if you can tell which person I am in this nursery school photograph. Here's a better picture, in case it's hard to tell which one I am. So you had asked how I got started in programming, and it's pretty simple. My dad was an acoustical physicist. And he worked at a place called Boat Beranek and Newman. I think he was the 12th employee there. People today probably know it as BBN Planet. So he had a teletype in the basement of our house, and it was an exciting machine for me. I don't know if people are used to seeing teletypes, but it was an exciting machine, and it had a G key that has the word bell written on it. And if you hold down the control key and you hit G, the bell rings. So around age 6, I would just ring the bell nonstop. And that was my kind of introduction to a keyboard and using a computer to make me happy somehow. And then in my teens, I went to Radio Shack when the TRS-80 came out, commonly known as Trash 80, was one of the first widely available micros. And I would sit inside the Radio Shack and type in little basic programs to make dots appear on the screen. And they would let me do that because they had no demonstration software. It was always good to show somebody using a computer rather than just have a box sitting there. So that's kind of how I get started.
That's great. I, like many programmers in the audience, got into programming due to video games, because it is every child's dream who's a geek to learn how to make video games. And that is how you think you'll make your money later in life. Then the cold, hard reality sets in, is that the gaming industry is very, very difficult. And then you start building boring business applications as a result of that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I started with the boring business applications. The first basic program I wrote was an accounting package in 1979. I was 19 years old, and the people at Kilovac, I was looking for something to program, and the people at Kilovac said, "Well, can you write an accounting package?" I said, "Oh, sure, I'll do that." So I charged them $400 and then wrote an accounting package for them in BASIC.
That's great. Wow. So you actually got started with a financially lucrative model. That's hilarious.
I don't know about lucrative. $400 for 6 months worth of work doesn't seem that good.
And so what got you interested in open source originally? And tell us a little bit about your early adventures in open source.
So, I mean, it's interesting. People say, how did you get involved in open source? But the way the world existed for me in the early 80s was open source. It wasn't really this kind of concept of closed source. The number of people who sat in front of a computer for a living seemed to be relatively small, unless they were writing COBOL for banks. But the number of people who are interested in innovating and doing something exciting with computing was relatively small. And I remember sitting in a restaurant in Cambridge and overhearing somebody say the word email, and I got up from my table and went over to talk to them because I thought, if they know what email is, then they already know who I am. We've already communicated on email, or we have friends in common or something, because there just weren't that many people on email. So open source was kind of like that. Every piece of software, you found another programmer who was interested in software with them, your source code, and say, hey, see, isn't this cool? And, oh, I solved the problem this way. How do you solve the problem? So it wasn't until I think the early to mid 80s when there was such a strong push to make software be proprietary as a intellectual good, something that you would have to pay money for. And when I realized that it was more difficult to learn from people who were not sharing, I was already aligned in a sense with Richard Stallman. So that's when the Free Software Foundation started. That's
great. Thank you, Brian. By the way, there might be a little bit of a connection slowdown on your end. We're hearing your audio perfectly, but the video seems to have cut out. So it could be a background process, or it could be another person competing for your internet. But we can still hear you, which is good. So let's keep going, and hopefully it'll improve.
Okay.
But while we wait for your video to come back, let's just keep talking and chat a little bit about Orchid. So tell us a little bit about kind of the problem that Orchid is trying to solve in the world, and what problem you guys noticed exists in the world.
So a good friend of mine, Steve Bell, had gone to China in order to invest in startups in China throughout the mid-90s. And while he was there and I was in the U.S., we would work together on different companies. So we started 2 companies while he was in China. And also while that was happening, I was starting to work on a VPN company that was more of a internet filter, a high-speed internet filter, which would allow end users to control the content that was visible to them or that they could receive, and also that could programmatically prevent content from going out, in a sense, the ultimate self-controlled censor. So, for example, we had a filter that said if it's after 1 o'clock and you're posting to Facebook, 1 a.m. your time, and you're posting to Facebook, then don't let it go through. Just stash it and remind the person in the morning it's time to send your post if you really want to post it. So these technologies started to merge. Steve Bell's need to kind of get access to the outside world. He was behind a restricted firewall and couldn't get to things like Wikipedia, for example, and my technology in building these high-speed networks kind of overlapped. And at that point, there was a lot of discussion between he and I about what a good solution for this problem would be. And then a number of years later, actually, I think it was maybe 3 or 4 years later, I said, I'm ready to build a solution. I drew something on a board. Steve had been talking to other people like Seven, Dr. Stephen Waterhouse. And the 3 of us got together and chatted, and I said it would be great if we brought in Jay Freeman, and we recruited Jay Freeman, and then we recruited Gustav Simonsen, who Jay Freeman, for those of you who don't know, is famous for his application Cydia, which is the alternative app store for the iPhone. Most people think of him as the jailbreaking guy. That's the way to kind of think of that. And Jay and I have known each other for quite a while. We met in 2002, I believe. And we also recruited Gustav Simonsen, who was one of the core developers of Ethereum, working on security and protocol. So then we had all the components we needed: networking, network security, architecture, fundraising, and we started our organization, Orchid, with a goal. I'm sorry, I kind of didn't answer your question.
It's okay.
With a goal to ending surveillance and censorship on the internet. We didn't want a centralized VPN like I had before, where all the traffic ran through one spot, and that spot could then be controlled by a government, for example, or by a bad actor, or even by a hacker. We wanted something that was decentralized and distributed so that you could kind of guarantee anonymity and also packet delivery without surveillance and censorship.
Wow, it's very inspiring. And so what is the current state of affairs in these other countries? I mean, is it the case that if you were an individual living in some of these other countries today, that you actually have your content being censored, and that there's actual practical impact in your life, censorship and surveillance happening on a regular basis?
So here in the U.S., I mean, let's just start with the U.S. It's pretty clear that pretty much everybody we're talking to right now is going through their ISP, and that might be Cox Cable or Time Warner, or it might be a larger ISP. But no matter what, all your traffic is being funneled through this ISP. This ISP knows your name, your social security number, your physical address, your credit card number, and they also know every single URL that you're visiting with your browser. That's a lot of information to be stored in one place. And even if you had a tremendous respect for the actual ISP and didn't think that they would perhaps use that information in some nefarious way to get advertisers to sell things to you, or to aggregate census information and hand it over to ICE, I don't know what people might do with it, but even if you trust them not to do that, some bad actor could come along and get all that information that's stored in one place. We know this happens all the time. 140 million credit card numbers are stolen. And I look at my friends and I say, 140 million credit card numbers. And they go, whew, thank goodness it wasn't mine. I think you're wrong.
Odds are that it is.
These things, and Americans tend to try to ignore that. They say, convenience matters, privacy doesn't matter that much. I'm not doing anything wrong. What do I care if people see that I'm browsing for hockey sticks and bras? But that's fine. And maybe that is fine for some people, but I actually think privacy is more than I'm not doing anything wrong. Thus, you can look into my entire life. I think privacy is part of the human existence, the same way being socialized is part of the human existence. I think that you need both of those things to be a complete and growing human being. So I think privacy is important. And then continuing on with that, 70% of the countries in the world have some sort of restrictive internet, and firing the people who live in that country from free access to all the information that's out there. And this can be problematic when your government is doing things you're not interested in, or you'd like more information about how to rearrange your living setup, your neighborhood, your local government, or your federal government. And so we think that's an important aspect, that the internet and computers were. The internet came along basically as I feel, as a communications tool, the same way the telephone is a communications tool, and the same way radio was a communications tool. But as time goes on, we now have the ability to talk to thousands of people simultaneously, like we're doing now, or to have long distance communications around the world. And those things are, I think those things are rights of the people who get to use the internet. So let's make sure that they have access to that.
That's stuff. Well said. It's a very fundamental problem that you're solving here, and I appreciate it. Brian, before we go into our next set of questions, are there any questions that you want to ask the audience? Anything you're wondering about our crowd today that they can answer in multiple choice fashion so that you can learn about them or hear their perspectives on the topic?
For those of you, first of all, if you've contributed to open source, I'd like to hear about it. I think that's important. No matter how or how large your contribution. I don't care if you wrote a brand new kernel or if you simply corrected a comment in somebody's small package somewhere.
I just added that as a poll, so we'll get real-time answers on that.
That's good. That's exciting.
If you have contributed to open source, then the next poll, I guess, is what year did you first start contributing?
How about what decade, maybe? Or because it has to be a multiple choice, right? So how many choices do you want me to list?
I think 5 choices would be good enough, starting with like 1985 or something like that. Maybe 25-year span, 5-year chunks.
Yep. I'll add that right now.
Yeah.
So we'll do 1985 to 1990, 1990 to 1995.
Yeah, cool.
1995 to 2000. Then we'll say 2000 2005, and then we'll say after 2005. How's that?
That's good. Hey, Rodrigo Madrid, that's one of the most clever comments I've seen. He wrote a small shell script, which echoes, "Hi, Brian Fox. My respects and thanks for allowing me to develop so many scripts."
Love it. It's great.
It's clever. Yeah.
So we can start to look at some of the results. So we've got the results from the first poll already in. Have you contributed to open source? Can you see this, Brian, on your screen on the bottom?
I
Click
can.
on polls.
Yeah, I can. We've got it's not quite 2-to-1 there for contributions. We have to fix this and make it 100%.
That's right. Hey, the numbers are increasing as we're speaking, actually.
So one more poll. How many people here have used open source?
Oh, come on. That's not a fair question.
You'd be surprised. I'm curious to find how many people say no.
All right. Let's find out.
Yeah.
How many of you have used open source? Or, yes or no? Yes if you've used open source, no if you have not used open source.
Exactly.
So far, we have 0 no votes. Someone's going to say a no vote just to be different. There we go. So it's 96%, 97% have used open source. So we've got an open source audience here. We've got
that's
a
good.
deep open source audience. Yeah.
I have an open source audience here, and I'm very excited also to see the number of younger people that are there. And I can't tell you the exact ages, but I know they're younger than me because pretty much everybody's younger than me. But I'm looking at this. After 2005, we've got this massive number of people, 81% have contributed to open source after 2005. And yet there's only one person on here who seems to have contributed to open source. Well, there's at least 2 from 1985 to 1990. So I'm glad to see that the world is catching up to the thing that we already knew was true, that sharing information with other people is the right way to go, and that the fastest way to move science and technology forward is the dissemination of ideas.
Yeah. We've actually got someone in the chat room who just made a comment about Microsoft and their acquisition of GitHub recently.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I'm curious, what do you think about that and how it relates to open source?
Thanks for that question, Ed. That's greatly appreciated. I can tell you that Microsoft is going through a massive change. Now, I'll kind of tell you my original position. I have not been a fan of Microsoft for many years, and the reason is not that they're closed source. That's a separate problem which exists across the universe. No, the reason was they made bad software acceptable. Now, I see over the last 5 or 6 years a very serious effort inside of Microsoft to change not only the perception of that, but the actual truth of that. And I think that the acquisition of GitHub is directly in line with that kind of thinking. I think that Microsoft has come to a place where they believe they need to embrace open source seriously and not as a surface endeavor, and that they're following through on that.
I agree. I've actually noticed that Microsoft has been actually, I think, the #1 contributor as a corporation to open source on GitHub recently, which is very inspiring to see. Great. So let's jump back to Orchid, because I would like to learn more about this project because it's so interesting. So we talked about surveillance as a problem, censorship as a problem, these ISPs being centralized bottlenecks. Tell us about the current solutions today. For example, there's this project called Tor. Tell us a bit more of what is Tor and what is the current solution, and why are those solutions not good enough that we need to start to create something on the blockchain?
So this is an interesting thing that happens. People tend to confuse the thing that we're building with VPNs, because we talk about the what I would call the killer app for this platform that we're building. The actual thing we're building is a platform, a marketplace that allows you to exchange goods and services with anybody essentially on the internet, where those goods and services are basically compute oriented. They could be bandwidth, it could be CPU cycles, it could be disk drive storage space, it could be a service running on a computer, such a database. The reason I'm always talking about this VPN solution is because it's really low-hanging fruit, and it's what I would call the killer app for this new internet. the same way email was the killer app for the original internet. And it's very interesting that prior to email, the communication levels between people revolved around whether or not you were near a phone. And then when we had cell phones, everybody was there. But the richness of documentation back and forth didn't really happen until we started getting email. And that's when international business started to take off. I think the same type of thing is true when we have free, unsurveilled internet. And so that's why I think that this VPN thing is a flagship application. But that having been said, there are other people who believe that a decentralized VPN is a good idea. And one of them, for example, is Tor. Tor stands for the Onion Router, and it's the way in which packets are moved from place to place. I think Tor's primary goal was anonymity, privacy and anonymity. They wanted completely anonymous transactions to take place. I think that Orchid's bandwidth goal is not rooted in anonymity. It's rooted in access. So I know that sounds kind of nuanced, but for me, it actually drives a difference in the way you think about building things and in the way you value what you build. So we use a form of onion routing in order to provide anonymity, and that's a good thing. We also use blockchain in order to incentivize people to provide these services. One of the downsides of Tor is your connection is only good as your slowest link. And so for those of you, I don't know, is the video working for you? You can see me okay?
You look great now. It's fantastic.
Okay. I look great now? You're saying before I didn't look that great?
Yeah, you've improved substantially.
It's like wine.
As you age, you get better.
Thank you so much. So in onion routing, you wrap up you wrap up the information that you want to send to, say, computer number 3 in these layers that you're going to send to computer number 2 and computer number 1. And then you send something to computer number 1. All they can see is that there's a packet supposed to go to computer number 2, and there's some opaque stuff inside of that. You send that to number 2. Number 2 says, oh, all I can see is supposed to send it to number 3, and so forth. So that's straightforward onion routing. But there's no incentive to make people want to route those packets except the goodness of their heart, which is great, but not everybody who has goodness of heart has fast bandwidth. So wouldn't it be great if everybody on this network was able to find some way to increase their bandwidth and to deliver packets rapidly? And wouldn't it be great if we can incentivize all kinds of people, like, for example, existing VPN providers to, instead of using a centralized solution, to use a decentralized solution? So that's what we've done. We've taken the source, the person who wants to get somewhere on the internet, they pay a small amount, and that's done with these ERC20 tokens. For those of you who know what that is, it's an Ethereum token, a cryptocurrency. They pay that, and it's distributed amongst the people that helped them to get. So there's a direct incentive, which is also different from Tor, a direct incentive and a lot of protections built into the platform for providing security and lack of surveillance.
Okay, great. And so, assuming that this rolls out as we expect and it's successful, are you worried that governments will try to shut you down? And can they even shut you down? Is it even possible?
Yeah, I'll tell the governments that are listening right now exactly how you can shut us down. Just get off the internet. If you turn off the internet, then yes, you'll have shut us down. But if you leave the internet open so that people in your country can communicate with people in other countries in order to do commerce, in order to do business, you will also be allowing people to exchange ideas. And fortunately, from my point of view, that's the benefit of open communication. Ideas. On the internet, 100%. But I'm glad that I have the opportunity to see the way other people think.
And so from a moral and ethical perspective, is there any concern that your team may be discussed internally that could this be used for illegal or shady activities as opposed to legitimate ones? And is that an ethical concern?
So the telephone is a fantastic tool, and as you well know, the telephone can be used to do anything that you could do when you're speaking face to face. People might worry about the NSA listening in on their phone call, and then they use scramble phones so you can't, look inside what's happening in the conversation. But getting rid of the telephone isn't the answer. Getting rid of the telephone doesn't get rid of crime or bad behavior. Those things need to be gotten rid of through other societal methods, not through the method of open access and communication. There is the possibility that someone can use a communications tool to communicate nefarious ideas or malevolent schemes. We do not try to enable that. Our default client, for example, default client for the bandwidth has whitelists in it, and so you can say, I'm willing to route traffic to these 10 internet sites and no other internet sites if they're not on this whitelist. And so you can kind of control from a personal perspective how much you want to give into the network and how much openness you want to provide. Somebody else might say, look, for a much higher fee, I'll let you go anywhere you want on any network, and I don't care what the traffic is that's traveling through me. That's a decision that an individual can make. And that's a decision that a user can make to say, I need that for some reason.
And I guess one could argue also that if you're a very sophisticated individual who's conducting illegal activities, you probably have access to very advanced ways to preserve your anonymity and your privacy already, but that the masses may not have those features today. And the average person out there who maybe wants to prevent themselves from stalkers or from identity theft, or maybe if you're a political activist and you're worried about getting arrested, even though you're a legitimate political activist, they may not have the tools that the most advanced illegal folks may have. So one could make the argument this is democratizing access, and that maybe there isn't an ethical concern because maybe those who are already doing the most illegal activities already have access to more advanced technology to do this. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I agree with that. I agree with that to some extent. I mean, I don't believe that that humanity moves towards the lowest common denominator as fast as they can. I'm not a believer that external regulation genuinely controls a lot of behavior of the individual. I think that external regulation controls some kind of societal norms. Certainly, it allows people to be thrown in jail for things that were once considered crimes and then eventually aren't. For example, smoking marijuana. We had our jails full of people who smoke marijuana. And now if you live in California or Colorado or many other states, it doesn't matter if you smoke marijuana. Same thing was true with alcohol. During Prohibition, you could be thrown in jail for drinking alcohol, but that certainly doesn't seem to be a problem today. So I don't. Once again, I think that access to technology does not mean use of it, does not necessarily mean that more people will use that technology for quote unquote nefarious schemes or bad behavior.
I agree.
I did see this. I told you I ran a VPN, and in the VPN, we examined the traffic flow to find out essentially what our users in aggregate were doing. And what we found out was about 18% of the traffic was to known pornography sites, which surprisingly mirrored exactly what was happening on the internet as a whole. Nobody was using our special VPN to get additional access than they normally use in their everyday life. So it was interesting for me to see right away the advent of a better technology or a more private technology did not modify the behavior of the users of technology.
Mm-hmm. It's very well said. And so tell us a little bit about the architecture and the technology behind Orchid. So what are you guys creating? What is the backbone for this, and how is it architected?
So it's fully that each person who participates in the network, so they run an application. The way it looks from an end user is you download an application and you run it, and that application allows you to say, I'd like to connect to the internet from this country, from that country, from that country. And then internally, the application helps you to find nodes that will help you to get there. And it also provides itself as a relay node for other users of the network. So individuals download an application and use it to set up what looks like a proxy on their machine. And then they're able to use that proxy to access the internet in the ways they would normally access the internet. It feels totally normal for them. And under the hood, nodes are selected from a essentially distributed hash. Kind of odd the way this is done. Nodes are selected. At least 2 relay nodes and an exit node are selected so that your traffic will bounce between multiple nodes, and each one of the nodes along the way can't tell whether you're the source or whether you're just a relay along the way. The only one that knows it's an exit node is the one that's actually going out to the internet, and it doesn't know who it's going out to the internet for.
And when you're bouncing traffic around these nodes, does that create a performance hit in terms of your browsing experience or your connection speed?
Speed of light is speed of light. So the only thing that slows us down is setting up and tearing down connections. And we have some clever networking in there that makes that fast and easy. So no. In fact, there's some evidence to show that you may incur greater throughput than you had originally thought. Wow. And that depends on what services are in there and what caching mechanisms can be used on the edges. So this go ahead.
And is there a cost trade-off? Like, do I have to spend more money to browse the internet because I have to pay these relayers? And is that significant?
Yes, you have to pay more money. Is it significant? No. As more and more people join the network, the cost per bit goes down and down and down. And we believe it's much cheaper than using a VPN. We think it's around 1/30th of the cost of using a VPN. So you're paying for the access to the internet that you didn't have before, and for the lack of surveillance and censorship that you didn't have before. But the amount you're paying is minuscule. It's pennies per gigabyte.
So if it's minuscule payments, and if this could even sometimes be faster than my normal browsing, then why would I not just use this all the time for everything?
Well, I imagine you will.
So is your long-term vision then that this is more than just a privacy layer for certain types of folks who are worried about surveillance and censorship, but it can actually be a broader use case than that?
It's a decentralized internet. The internet's, it's odd. I have a talk that goes through this from top to bottom. We're just kind of bouncing around in there, but I think it's great. The internet, I believe the internet used to be, in a sense, decentralized. Nodes joined up with this collection of telephone wires, and everybody was just part of this networking thing. And routing, especially like email routing, you used to have to specify your route the entire way. I don't know if anybody remembers email addresses that have like exclamation marks in them. But that would be go to this machine, bang, go to that machine, bang, go to this machine, that's your destination. And with the advent of these kind of centralized ISPs, that stuff went away. And especially with the advent of the domain name system, we ended up centralizing the decentralized internet. We're just going back to the way it really used to be. We're letting every node that participates in the network be part of the infrastructure of this new network. And there's no reason it shouldn't be like that forever. And the existing ISPs become the physical wire backbone that we use, the same way the telephone copper was the physical backbone for our original internet.
It's incredible vision. And how, so assuming that the technology is built to spec over the next year or so, how do you then roll this out? How do you get users as well as enterprises to adopt this? What is the go-to-market strategy for this technology?
So goal number one is, as I said, is basically hit the lowest hanging fruit, and that is people who are stuck behind restricted firewalls, unable to get access to the internet. So that 70% of the world, as we talked about, if you're in Bahrain and you want to talk to somebody on Facebook, or if you're in Beijing and you need to look at a Wikipedia page, this can help you do that. And I think that's a positive thing. And as we kind of move forward from that, the number of people who are creating this infrastructure increases, and we hit critical mass. You get to about 1 million nodes, and it seems silly to use a VPN company if the VPN isn't actually using this thing. And it seems odd to avoid using this network when this network provides the best access and the easiest mode of communication. And companies are going to say, well, if we're not part of this networking thing, then we'll be left out. The same way companies are saying, if we're not part of this open source movement, then we're being left out and left behind. So I see this having the same kind of natural progression as Linux. You've got a cheaper, faster, better solution. People are going to use it.
Yeah, I mean, it has organic incentives to use it, so that'll
Exactly.
cause organic virality by itself. And you guys created your own token for this. You're not just using Ethereum as your token, but you have your own token. Tell us more about the philosophy behind that and the token economics and why you made your own token.
So we wanted to decouple the movement of crypto in general from the value that exists with the token that is used to drive the Orchid network. That's one reason why we have our own token. And think of it as I don't know, payment on toll roads. In order to get, I don't care if you're going to Utah or Canada, you're still driving on a toll road, and so you pay some access fee to get onto the toll road. And the fee that you pay on that toll road, I don't need that to be controlled by whether or not the U.S. government has thrown tariffs on steel. I to how the value of the toll road's delivered direct to the user. So why not have our own currency for that toll road that's its own truth, if you will? So that was one of the reasons why we chose having our own token. We specifically chose ERC20 because Ethereum was designed for this. That's what it was. That's the purpose behind Ethereum. We use smart contracts to enable the payment and distribution. We use something called probabilistic micropayments in order to reduce the total number of. I don't see you anymore, but are we still connected?
We're still connected. You sound great. It's just your connection
Okay,
might not be receiving my video, but I'm still broadcasting.
Okay. Okay, great. So
yeah, just to riff on what you just said there, Brian, I would also imagine there's governance reasons to have your own token as well, right? You don't want Ethereum whales controlling the voting for how Orchid evolves, right? You probably want folks who are bought into the Orchid token to be doing that voting, right?
That's correct. I would also like to point out there's something that might not be obvious to everyone. We're building this new internet, and we're happy and excited about that. But it's its own ecosystem and does not require us after it's up and running. So if 2 years from now, when there's a million nodes and people are communicating freely on this internet, if myself and all my colleagues go away, nothing changes. That information continues to flow. That network continues to exist. We're not part of that. It's truly decentralized in that way. So we mint a fixed number of tokens, and those tokens get distributed out to people to start using a network, and then the tokens over time, because there's a fixed number of them, over time each token increases in value, but you can pay a portion of a token, a fraction of a token, in order to get access to the internet. The price per gigabit goes down, and the value per token goes up. It's its own ecosystem, unrelated to the vagaries of Bitcoin.
And do you imagine that developers will build applications on top of Orchid? And if so, what types of applications would you build?
So the flagship application we're talking about, and I keep mentioning it's this bandwidth application, but there's some super obvious ones that are just waiting there. For example, file storage. I think about Dropbox. A decentralized Dropbox makes a ton of sense. I've got a million nodes out there. Why am I not just storing my content across these million nodes and paying those individual nodes to store some of my content? There are other applications that are similar to that. Compute cycles. I want to solve some large genome problem, so why not get a million computers working on that simultaneously? And this is just a marketplace for the exchange of service and value.
Great. And then last question before we move on to other subjects here. So if a developer wants to get involved in Orchid or to stay appraised of your future developments, so that way they can start building when the technology is ready. How can they? What actions can they take today? How can they learn more?
I think the right email address is info@orchidsource.org. Of course, you can always send email to bfox@orchid.com. And that will get to me. I may not respond as quickly as you'd like, depending on the volume of emails I get. But we never discard an email because we don't know who sent it. We always try to figure out what's going on.
That's great.
So I'd like people to.
And what's the timetable, by the way, to create the technology and to have it ready for folks? Like roughly, I know it's hard to predict exactly with these things, right?
We did a demonstration of the networking concepts last November, the beginning of last November, in Cancun, Mexico, using a cell phone and a laptop in the rain. It was a great demo. I think there's a YouTube video of it somewhere. Since then, there's been additional architectural design work done and more. We want this platform to be the most robust platform it can be. We think that there's a lot of people out there trying to build a service, and they're kind of ignoring the necessity of a quality platform underneath it. And we think that our platform can enable those people who are building services. So we really want the service builders to come over and build on top of our platform. We're talking releasing sometime in the last quarter our public network launch in the last quarter of this year.
Great. Let's go to the audience, take a few audience questions. Then we'll go back to Brian, talk a little bit about open source voting as well, which is a topic that Brian is extremely passionate about, and is also, by the way, a great use case for the blockchain. So, So Brian, the number one question we have here is answered by, is basically, do you think humanity could ever use personal unique data such as DNA as a blockchain transaction signatures, such as a private key? So can you use your own DNA as part of a private key? Is that part of our future at any point?
Perhaps. I've thought for quite some time that there was public-private key pairs from iris scan. Enough wiggle room in an iris scan that makes it difficult to get definitive values like that. I can't answer the truth of using DNA to help generate public-private key pair, which is or I should say symmetrical key sets, which is what is needed in order to kind of do what we're talking about. So it's conceivable. It's certainly, there's nothing wrong with the idea. I don't think it's going to happen next year. I think we're looking a number of years out.
That's fair. So the Orchid versus Tor, we've already answered that question. Let's see here. Here's a question by Siraj. This is more of a fundamental question. Why can a blockchain not be hacked? What is not hackable about a blockchain?
The number of people who agree on it. So if you have a blockchain that exists with just one node, it's trivially hackable. The person who has that node mutates the data in any way they want, and they are the one true source of information. But the main goal behind decentralization and blockchain and decentralization is consensus models, where large groups of individual nodes agree on what the blockchain says. So mutating the data in the blockchain requires you to own, it's called the 51% attack. You need to own more than half of that network. And if you're doing something whose goal is to remain decentralized and the members of it are aligned in that goal, it's often difficult for somebody else to buy 51% of that network.
That's great. Thanks, Brian. And then I'm going to skip down a little bit because there's a question that relates to your background in particular by Christian Wilkie, which is there any advice that you have for people interested in getting involved with free software and the free software movement?
Write some software. People ask me this all the time, and they think it's hard to get involved. I'll tell you, it was easy for me to get involved. And the reason you know about me now is because I got involved and then I waited 30 years. You didn't know about me when I started doing it. It was 30 years of people using my software that made it work. And my software isn't magical. It's not the best code on the planet. I'm not the only human being that could have created this. I just happened to be at the right place at the time, and I wrote the right tool that's used by lots of people. Yay me, I'm happy for that. But it's very easy to get involved in free software. Scratch your own itch. Look around on GitHub. Find some problem that's been bugging you for a long time. This tool I use is fantastic, but I sure wish it would just do something slightly different when I press N. Make a pull request and say, this is what I want to do, and this is how I'm trying to do it. It is not difficult. And don't think you need to start at the top. I've said, and I mean it, fixing comments to be true or to get rid of typos is a high value proposition. And we need people to start doing that. And you'll find as you do that, you will be learning more and more about the software that you're commenting on or that you're working with, and you'll have more and more respect from the people who wrote those lines of code to begin with.
That's a great answer. Thanks, Brian. Then the next question here is privacy versus transparency. It seems like there are two sides of a coin. What's your view on that?
I think privacy is something that belongs to an individual and shouldn't be mandated and should not be controlled in a sense by the state or by nation actors. So if I choose to be totally transparent in some of the things I'm doing, that's my choice, and I think that's a completely reasonable choice. And if I choose to have privacy around some of the things I'm doing, if I don't wish, I'm a relatively public figure relative to other programmers, perhaps a relatively public figure. But I don't normally talk about my children, what their names are, what grade they're in, how they're doing academically or whatever. That's not something that I share with the public. That's, in my opinion, that's their private information and not mine to kind of divulge. So, sure, two sides of the same coin, or simply a needle on a spectrum.
That's great. Thank you, Brian. Okay, so let's go into the topic of open source voting, which you've been very passionate about. In fact, you even spoke about it at a previous Hack Summit before blockchain was such a hot topic. So maybe you can tell us today a little bit about the problem that we're trying to solve with open source voting. So what problems do we have today with voting systems? Maybe an obvious question.
So the biggest problem, there's two gigantic problems we have with the voting systems today. The first one, the absolute first one, is they're proprietary. There's just something horribly wrong about a democratic system that is proprietary and not transparent. I need to know my vote is counted as cast. And if I'm using a piece of proprietary, if I'm sliding my ballot into a black box and the only thing that comes out is a number, I have no idea if the black box did the right thing. It could have done the wrong thing because somebody's mean and wanted it to do the wrong thing, or because somebody's evil, or because somebody came along and hacked it, or because somebody made a mistake when they typed the thing in, like in Office Space when they get millions of dollars instead of tens of dollars. It's just a decimal point. It's not a bug. So how will I be able to trust that this machine is able to even count my vote correctly if I can't even see the code that it's using to count my vote? And the same thing goes for the firmware in that machine, and the firmware for the scanner, and the software of the operating system. If those things aren't open and available to me, I can't tell what my risk factor is related to security flaws, and I can't tell what my bug factor is. It's very interesting. I don't understand this. People say writing code is called programming. In my world, it's called bugging, because the only way you can debug something is if there's a bug in it, and the only way you can create a bug is by writing software. So as far as I'm concerned, programmers are buggers. That's what they do for a living. And other programmers are debuggers. It's just how it works. And I know that that's true. I know that's true in software that exists in these proprietary voting systems. So that's number one. Number two is there's no reasonable audit process that is universally applied to our voting, to our election system here in the U.S., and that's a big problem. And the rules that we have in place for doing audits tend to throw away anything that looks like it's been tampered with, which is kind of the whole point of doing an audit. I don't need to validate. I don't need to validate everything that was correct. I need to validate why something's not correct. I need to find the incorrect things and get rid of them. But if you take a look at what happened, for example, in the 2016 election, all of the precincts in and around Detroit didn't get audited. And the reason they didn't get audited is because the number of ballots in the ballot box didn't match the number of votes that were supposed to have been cast. Sometimes there were 4 ballots in the ballot box, and yet 350 votes were cast there. And sometimes there were 350 votes in the ballot box, and yet 50 votes were cast there. So all of those vote counts, all of that auditing was thrown away specifically because of this discrepancy. But I believe the discrepancy is the problem.
Makes sense.
If we only count the things, if we only audit the things that are correct, then we're going to find out that the audit is correct. A little plug, please go to myvoteismine.org. Myvoteismine.org. There's a short video there which kind of describes a lot, gives some information about our election systems and some discrepancies we saw in the 2016 election. Not that I need to harp on the 2016 election. It's just a shining example of why our election system needs reform. Whether you believe something untoward happened with actual election counts and vote counts in 2016 is kind of besides the point. We can't tell. That's the point. We should be able to know for certain that our votes are counted as cast. That's the way a democratic process works, and I want that for everyone, whether they agree with me politically or not.
So hopefully everyone will visit that site. Thanks for that, Brian. And tell us a little bit about like how you envision open source voting being implemented. Are there any projects out there that we should be aware of? Are there non-blockchain solutions? Are there blockchain solutions? Like, help us educate us about the state of the industry right now.
So most of the people who've tried to use blockchain, I'm going to write this down. Make sure I get this. You want to talk about the blockchain, and you want to talk about existing projects that are out there. So I'm involved in open source voting through. I started getting involved in open source voting around 2007. A man named Brent Turner and another man, Alan Deckert, came to me and talked to me about something they've been trying to do for about 7 years at that point. And I was interested and excited, and I said, yeah, this is a real problem. We should do something about it. And my group, I have a group of programmers that I work with. We built a open source voting system, and we used it in 2008 at Linux World. And it was a great success. People liked it, but it was much more of a proof of concept than an actual production system. And then the group of people I was talking about with Brent Turner and Alan Deckert and myself and some others worked on a new organization called CAVO, the California Association of Voting Officials. That's cavo-us.org. cavo-us.org, and also the National Association of Voting Officials, which is navo-us.org. And we've been pushing hard for open source GPL v3 or AGPL v3 in our municipalities, and especially here in California. San Francisco, through our efforts, political efforts, San Francisco is now on board and has found some grant money for producing an open source election system. There's been some discussion around how open source the system needs to be in order to satisfy California's needs, but I think that we're moving forward in that. So that's my initial involvement with that, and that's kind of like where the status of that is. There is an open source election system running in New Hampshire, which has been running for the past year and a half, and will continue to run. That came from Dr. Juan Gilbert, who is also a member of CAVO, and he's at the University of Florida. He's built a system that makes accessibility possible for all these people. I believe the same thing will be true. We're getting more things. Then we talked about, you wanted to talk a little bit about blockchain and voting, which I think is super important. Currently, most people think about blockchain and voting as the place they store the vote, and that being the sole source of truth. I think there's some leaps to be made before that actually can be reasonable and can make good sense. We talked about a 51% attack. When you're talking about voting, I wouldn't be surprised if Russia bought 51% of machines, for example, to control 51% of the nodes it controls on. So I'm not yet there, but I do think that there's a audit process that can be enabled with the blockchain that can make auditing much faster and much more reliable as it relates to the existing audit practice using paper. I advocate paper. We should have paper involved in our elections, and the paper should be stored, and the paper should be used for hand counting and for audits. That's important and makes a lot of sense. I also believe that there is software is required to run a proper election in the kind of time frames that we want to run elections. And so I think that it's important to have all open source software. If we can have open hardware as well, that will make me a very happy camper. And it will also enable these things like access for certain types of disabled voters. People who are sight impaired can often get some help from this type of software.
So
what I was going to say.
In your vision here for still continuing to rely on paper for votes, but using blockchain for auditing those votes, is there a role for electronic votes in that process as well? Is the future that you're thinking would be a hybrid of both paper votes and electronic votes, or would it be all paper?
So in our system, the design of our system, which is called the Deckert design, from after Alan Deckert, who came up with this, we use electronic systems to produce a paper ballot. The paper ballot can be visually and electronically verified on independent machines before it is placed into a tallying machine. The tallying machine is used to rapidly tally the votes that come in. So this is not a hybrid. I guess you could call this a hybrid of electronic, but really what we're using is software and hardware to produce a traceable piece of paper that can be easily validated. So that's the goal there. That's the design of that system.
I see. And then from a political perspective, how do we convince governments to embrace open source voting? Is there a budget issue that they have? Are there political forces at work that require lobbying to get this to actually be approved? Like, how do we practically get this to actually be rolled out?
Lobbying helps. Help us join Cavo, talk to your local representatives. We need more human beings to understand and agree that transparency in our election system is a positive thing. There are organizations out there that are spending a lot of money pushing against transparency. Those organizations are the proprietary voting system organizations. And they spend a substantial amount of money communicating with representatives in government saying, please vote for legislation that allows proprietary voting systems to exist. And wow. If it's not an issue on the level of your representative, then they won't care about it. And the reason they're called your representative is because they're supposed to represent you. So tell them how you want to be represented. Please help me. I see that Yash Kataria thinks that decentralized government will solve the problem of voting. Well, only if you don't have to vote.
And then beyond voting, do you think that other government systems should also be based on open source? And where's the limit, and which systems do you think are important to be based on open source? So
that's a great question. People talk about the security value of open source or the security of open source, and they say, like if it's open source, everybody can see the code, and that means bad guys can take advantage of it. So I would say this to you. There are essentially no systems that the bad guys can't look at the source code to. That the good guys can't look at the source code to. You can hack in and get the code. You can hire a spy to steal software from inside the NSA and give it to people outside of the US. You can do that, and the source code is then delivered. And what's been prevented? You've prevented the hundreds of thousands of good guys who want to look at that code and validate it and add security features to it and make sure that it does what it says it does. You've eliminated those people from the process and only allowed the bad guys to look at it and take advantage of it and exploit it. So the advantages of proprietary software in quote unquote security sensitive areas is dubious at best. So I think that almost every piece of software we use in simply published. And the question of when you publish that, when you actually start using it. I mean, I think those two things are slightly different. So I would, for example, happily publish all of the voting election system software code. I'd make that public as soon as we possibly can and not use it until we have consensus from the community that it's safe to use.
Thank you. It's a great answer, Brian. So why don't we go ahead and take a few more audience questions. Brian, can you see the questions and answers section on the bottom? Does that open for you? For you to see
Yes,
what questions people are at?
that.
You can feel free to grab any question that you think is interesting and answer that. So feel free to run with it.
How does Orchid prevent people from being monitored, controlled, and censored? Orchid doesn't prevent people from being controlled, but it can help with monitoring and censoring. If you have free, unfettered access to the internet and it's anonymous in the sense that you're bouncing through a large number of people. I mean, the canonical example is here's a firewall. You're on this side, and this is the side you want to go to, and this thing is blocking your access to, say, Wikipedia, but it's allowing a web video conference between an individual here and an individual here. Great. Then I can run my data over this fake video conference and let that thing go out to the internet. And so that's one way we get past a restricted firewall and allow people behind that firewall access to the stuff on the other side of it. And the way we do it provides some anonymity, which helps to prevent people from being monitored and censored. I think that answers a couple of those questions. Could we create a blockchain on Bash? No. But would you like to? Because I simply forbid it. But I'll tell you a very interesting story. I was chatting with Bram Cohen, actually, who did BitTorrent. And he and his friend said, what's the best thing for you about having written Bash? And I said, it's when people tell me that they've seen Bash in a place that I wouldn't expect to see it. And this used to happen to me early on. Because, oh, I had a printer and it had a shell in it. Oh, I had this network control device and it has the Bash shell in it. You know, oh, there's a Coke machine that's running the Bash shell. Oh, that's cool. You know, so then one of them says to me, did you realize that all of the nuclear power plants in the U.S. are run on Bash shell scripts?
Wow.
So I fell down laughing. And I said, how is this possible? And he said, it's the automation layer. In order to get a C++ program installed in a nuclear power plant, you have to go through about 2 years of auditing and regulation. But you're allowed to write scripts. So these nuclear power plants don't hire programmers, they hire system administrators, and the system administrators write scripts to help with automation.
Wow. So they circumvent the regulation. That's, you know what that reminds me of? It's kind of like circumventing the App Store release process for mobile apps, and doing dynamic updates. That's hilarious.
Yeah, exactly. How would you get started contributing to open source? Like I said, find your itch and scratch it. You're already using an open source tool. It probably does 99.99% of what you want. Find the thing it doesn't do. Start by writing a suggestion. Don't worry, you'll get a lot of feedback, and get thick skin. Don't worry about somebody telling you your idea is stupid. They're right or they're wrong, but that has nothing to do with it. Just keep making ideas. Oh yeah, a Botcoin price prediction for 2019. Nah. Is there a question on there, Ed? You think I should? Oh, why are Bash scripts so annoying? somebody asks. Frederic Marinho. Well, Frederic, I don't know exactly why they're so annoying, but they are really annoying. They are super annoying. And the only thing you can do is try to write better and better scripts to make them less annoying for the people who read them. But I agree with you. Bash scripts are pretty annoying. What system do you prefer, FreeBSD or Linux? Linux. On what system, GNU/Linux? What system you work the most and use Bash? Well, now the system I've used the most is probably Mac OS X, but it used to just be Linux, and before that, it was NetBSD.
I also had to convert to a Mac as well. Like when I arrived in San Francisco,
Yeah.
I learned very quickly going to every coffee shop that there were 0 PCs in these coffee shops, and the creators of the programming languages were using Macs to create their languages. Like Ruby on Rails was created on OS X. And so if you were to actually build software, it would be the most compatible if you used the same operating system as the inventor of the language. So reluctantly, I had to, over time, shift. Now I'm actually a Mac guy, and I actually kind of like it. So,
yes, I'm wearing Apple earbuds.
I see. So a couple other topics before we go here. You are tell us a little bit more about Marvin Minsky. So for those in the audience who don't know, maybe you tell us a little bit more about him and how you know him, and maybe some lessons that the audience can learn from Marvin Minsky.
Marvin Minsky, to be the father of artificial intelligence. Long before I knew that was the case, he was the father of my friends, Julie and Henry Minsky, the twins. They're about 4 years younger than me. And he was a friend of my dad's, and that's how I ended up meeting him. And Marvin was always interested in connecting people. He was a great connector, and he had this amazing talent of letting you think that you came up with this really smart idea that he clearly thought of on his own and just fed you. And he had this incredible talent of he never BS'd. He just let you grow into his intellectual space. It was a beautiful thing to be around, and it was always a marvel to be near him and to chat with him. He passed away about 3 years ago, so it was a devastating thing for the community and for me personally, in fact.
Sorry to hear that, Brian. I think it's very aspiring, I think, to be able to convey the concepts that he did, and I think we all have a lot to learn from him. So thank you for that. Let's see, last couple questions here. So let's talk a little bit about kind of the Free Software Foundation and what it was like in the early days for you there. So you kind of helped to create this, and
yes,
what role did you see it kind of playing initially, and what was it like in the early days working with Richard Stallman, and what was it like before kind of where we are today with the open source movement as big as it is?
I was just in Japan speaking at an open source conference, the Linux Expo there, open source conference. And there I ran into Bradley Kuhn, who is an important mucky-muck at the Free Software Foundation and has been for 30 years. Bradley and I had never physically met before, but we'd spoken in email, and so it was great to see him physically. While we were there, we went to lunch. We hung out, went to lunch, and chatted. We sat there for about 2.5 hours chatting, and most of what we were chatting about was RMS. And it turns out that working with him today is exactly the same as it was back in the mid-'80s.
So maybe for some context, maybe you could educate our audience on who is RMS and what is he known for and all that stuff. Maybe you can get everyone up to speed first.
Well, Richard Stallman is pretty much known as the kind of the creator of free software, the concept of free software. He in 1984 he was about 10 years before that. He was a physics student at Harvard. And he went to MIT to a lab to kind of talk to some engineers. And while he was there, he started writing software. And then he just didn't go back to Harvard, and he just stayed at MIT, where he still is today. And while he was writing software there was a whole community of people sharing ideas and sharing software. And then along came, I don't want to get in too much political trouble, but along came a guy named Gosling, and he wrote a version. Richard Stallman had put together a version of software called Emacs. It was a conglomeration of many different people's efforts towards building a better visual editor for a computer. And then Gosling came along and wrote what he called Gosling Emacs, and he didn't share that with everybody. And at the same time, some people at MIT started a company called Symbolics, which was building a commercial version of the Lisp machine, and they didn't invite Richard to come with them. And Richard felt like there was a lack of sharing, and at that point, he decided to attack back by making software that was freely available to everyone, that would mimic the software that was useful, that was not freely available. So this Emacs thing and this Symbolics thing. And he did that for a couple of years. He essentially tracked the development of two very large projects with dozens of programmers on each. He single-handedly kind of tracked that development. And then in 1984, he had the idea to build a foundation that would build an army of programmers that would do more things like that. And around that time, I think the same month that he was like, oh, maybe I should do this, that's when he and I started talking about working together, and that's when I started writing software for the Free Software Fund.
Great. Thank
so
you,
that's who Richard Stallman is, and he's well known for his. He's a brilliant man, and he's well known for his views, which are very binary. He is a diplomat, political views, and he'll tell you what they are. And by political, I don't really mean who's president. I mean political views about software and about the names of software and about how people should think about things. So,
thank you, Brian. Yeah, I've noticed that in my own life as I've interacted with entrepreneurs and engineers, is that sometimes some of the folks who are the most brilliant may not be quite as balanced in other areas of their life, such as speaking in a charismatic way and things like that. But that doesn't diminish their contribution to the world. They still are significant contributors, and we should acknowledge them for that.
Yes, I agree 100%. And I mean, Richard Stallman's a pleasant individual to hang around. He can be frustrating at times to work with, because he can dig his heels in on a particular issue, and organizations where he's in charge. So when he digs in his heels, you're a little frustrated because there's no real place to go. Thank you, Scott. So don't get me wrong. I mean, he's a very personal individual. I still care a lot about Richard. He's one of my few colleagues that I've had come to my mother's house for Christmas.
Wow, that's impressive.
My mother, yeah, it was actually quite impressive. And then my mother was her usual charming, kind self, proper. And then the following day or something, I was speaking with her, and she said, I think your friend is a little odd.
That's great.
Yeah, it was good. Yeah.
The last couple of questions here before we show everyone your guitar. I am slowly trying to convince Brian to do that. So in addition to Bash, you also maintained Emacs, and are people still using Emacs? Sorry, what was that? Oh, there's the guitar.
People still using Emacs? It's a bass. It's a bass. See, it only has 4 strings. Man. 4 strings.
Sorry, it's a bass. Well, now that you have it out, perhaps you can play us something.
Okay.
Damn, that's awesome. Legit. You're a multifaceted developer. Skilled in many ways.
I am a bass player in real life.
You have a band that you play with?
I have a couple bands that I play with here in Santa Barbara, and occasionally I play with a couple of a Grammy award-winning guy. You have to look that one up, though.
Wow.
Ronnie Laws. So
thank you for that. So I was asking about Emacs. So A, are people
You said that people still using it. Yes, I still use it.
You still use it? Wow.
Emacs is for me personally, Emacs is a very, very important piece of software. It is. I would say it is the most important piece of software I've ever used. So when I first came across Emacs, I noticed immediately how well it was architected. You could feel the programmer intent behind everything, and it was. I saw it as a software architect. You know, I could see it that way, and I could guess what functions would be available, and if my guess was wrong, then the function didn't exist, and I could figure out how to add it and so forth. And this was back when I was using using Emacs on a DEC PDP-10. So a long time ago, before it was what people think of modern Emacs. Mm-hmm. But that inspired me to write a version of Emacs for the Apple II computer, which I did, and that was called Emacs, which was my Apple version of Emacs, and it was pretty complete. It had MedX completion and dynamically loadable libraries and all this stuff, all written in assembler, and I was very happy with it. And then I went over to MIT, and Richard Stallman was coming down the steps, and that's how I met him. I said, "Hey, I wrote this thing. I'm so excited. The Emacs changed my whole life, and I wrote an editor called Emacs. It's just like Emacs." And he said, "I don't know if I have a good distribution point for that." So that was my meeting with how I met Richard Stallman. But
that's great.
But it seriously shaped my understanding of software architecture, and that's held me in good stead my entire life. And then I often hear that there's this kind of argument between Emacs and Vim or VI, and I don't really understand it, because to me it sounds like people are saying that there's an argument between driving a car and eating a sandwich. They're two completely different things. They don't really overlap or intersect except in the most superficial of ways. They both can be used to edit text, but if you think of Emacs as a text editor, you're leaving out 95% of its functionality. So Emacs for me is an IDE, and VI is a text editor. I don't have anything. There's nothing wrong with VI as a text editor. I think it edits text fine. But just to put it in perspective, there's an implementation of VI that has been written inside of Emacs. There's no implementation of Emacs that has been written inside of VI.
Wow, very interesting. And what is your take on these new cloud IDEs that are kind of web-based environments? Do you think that's our future, or
Sure.
Are those going to be failed experiments?
I don't think they're failed experiments. I think it's really an architectural choice. So do I think it's a good idea to have your IDE stored on a centralized server far away from you? No. Do I think that using web-based technologies to build these applications is smart? Yes, 100%. I think it's great. It doesn't prevent me from running that thing locally on my computer, the same way I can run a web server on my computer, right? It doesn't prevent me from running multiple instances of those that can all be synchronized using, Git or whatever other synchronization technology you want to use to keep everything secure and safe. So I think that's fine. I don't have any issue with that at all.
Mm-hmm. That's great.
I just there are some differences. I mean, there are differences between Emacs and these other things, but I think that web-based IDEs are fine.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like there's a couple of camps out there.
I'd rather not learn. I'd rather not learn. Sorry, go ahead, Ed. I missed it.
No. Finish your thought.
I'd rather not learn 10 different tools in order to do one conceptually similar thing. I don't need one tool for writing Python and another tool for writing Ruby and another tool for editing HTML and another tool. I don't need all those tools, right? What I need is, something easy I can understand and I can use that has the benefits. I need the one useful toolbox, and then I can kind of build all kinds of things with that.
Right. So, all right, we're about to end here with Brian. We'll take a last couple questions from the audience before we go here. So, Gladys Vilkans asks, when will Orchid be available to be used, and will there be a crowd sale? I assume he's interested in potentially investing. What are you guys planning on that front?
So we plan at network launch to distribute large number of tokens. The information about I think the information about how we're doing that is in our white paper. If you go to orchid.com, our white paper is available there. I urge people to go there and take a look at it and to give us feedback on it. As I mentioned before, we expect to have a live network sometime in the last quarter of this year, maybe as late as the beginning quarter of next year. But I believe that we're looking at the last quarter of this year. And that should be ready for additional applications to be built on top of it. So not only have a network that's live and up and running, but we will have a call for developers to come develop applications that run on top of that network, and we should have some sample applications for people to look at that time. What was the other part of that question? And is there going to be a crowd sale? Yeah, the current plan right now doesn't necessitate a crowd sale. The reason to do a crowd sale, I think, is to raise a gigantic sum of money, and I don't think we need to raise a gigantic sum of money that way. If we do need to raise more money, we may have a private sale for accredited investors only that are KYC'd, AML, so anti-money laundering and know your customer and all that kind of stuff. And if we did that, we would do that sometime in the fall, I think.
I see.
So
very helpful. Thank you. And then last question is from Posker. Sorry if I misspelled your name there. How can you earn money getting into open source software? How can they make it a career? Obviously, he may be passionate about it, but how can he actually make money off of it?
So there are, most of my friends have made a tremendous amount of money, and most of my friends are open source software people. The ways in which you can make money on open source software are as myriad and interesting as the ways you can make money on closed source software. One obvious way to do this is to provide a service and support company. So the software is free, but the service and support costs something. Cygnus started, I think, in 1987, and what their product offering was 4 times a year we'll give you a CD with the free software foundation software on it, a C compiler, editor, and so forth, and we'll charge you $100,000 for that. And they got sold to Red Hat. One of them became the CTO of Red Hat. They got sold to Red Hat, I think it was $750 million. So there are plenty of ways to make money in open source. The same way as you can make money. You can sell your software, for example. People don't buy the source code. People here buy microwave ovens. And the microwave ovens have software in them. If the software was open source, would it make it bad for you to buy the microwave oven?
Fair enough.
Or put another way, let's say that there's a microwave oven and the software that it runs is called Microwave Oven 2.0, and it's on GitHub and everybody can look at it. It has these features you like. And the problem is that there's a microwave oven that sells for $69, and that one's pretty good. And then there's one that sells for $389, and that has 10x the power. Some people buy the $389 one, and some people one, and they trust both of them. So go ahead and write Microwave Oven 2.0 and be the one that enables that for everybody. Trust me, I'll buy one of your ovens.
Love it. Thank you, Brian. On a personal note, I'll say here that as we wrap up that, I see blockchain as a tremendous innovation that contributes to the open source movement. Because with blockchain, you can actually give away the technology completely for free, 100%, not keep any of it proprietary, and you can still monetize the tokens and hold back a small percentage of them to keep a team employed and to actually create a salary for yourself. And that's something that hasn't existed in the past. For example, I'm a board observer on a company called NodeSource, which is an enterprise version of Node.js, where there's an open source version of Node and there's the enterprise version of Node. And one of the things that we've always struggled with is, where do we draw the line between the free and open source version of Node and the enterprise version of Node? And it's a constant challenge and a struggle that all open source companies have who have an enterprise version of that software. Well, with blockchain, you don't have to do that. With blockchain, you have a single code base that's free. Everyone gets every feature in that code base, and you monetize it by holding back a small percentage of the tokens to pay salaries for your team. So I'm personally very excited about open source and creating an income for yourself, in the long run through the blockchain as well. So I think it's fantastic.
I think that's true. But you know what I think is really interesting, and since you're on the board, maybe you can fix that. There's no reason for the enterprise version to be different than the non-enterprise version. The reason people are buying the enterprise version is because you're supporting it.
Mm-hmm.
That's why they're buying it. That's why they buy Red Hat, because Red Hat supports Linux. That's why they buy Ubuntu, because Ubuntu supports Linux. All that source code is totally freely available. You could just drop it onto the iron and be ready to go. There's lots of beautiful Linux distros out there. But people pay, especially enterprises, pay for enterprise software so they can talk to someone if the enterprise software doesn't do what they want. Or they can talk to somebody if they want a specific feature and know that they have a monetized way to get that person to listen to them.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think an enterprise version is... Yeah.
I mean, this is
you're on the board. You're on the board. Fix it.
I'll tell you, I hold a dinner for CEOs of open source companies at least once a year, and the number one topic that comes up is this exact subject: is that they are having challenges in this area. So it's going to be an ongoing concern, and you're very right to bring it up. So thank you, Brian. I really appreciate your time today. We learned a lot from you. Please check out the Orchid protocol online. Learn more. When the product is released, please try to build applications on top of it. See what you can do with it. And please support open voting and free software. And Brian, thanks again for all your time today. We learned a lot from you. It's always a privilege to have you here. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Ed. Thank you very much. It's great.
Great. So audience, we're going to be back in just a second here with a panel of investors who are going to teach us about how they look at investing in blockchain projects. And it'll be moderated by another investor. Her name is Caroline. And we have a limit in Crowdcast, 4 video participants at a time. So we're going to have an investor panel of 4, where one of the other investors will be moderating that panel. So I will be back for the session after that, but you'll get to hear from some of the smartest investors in blockchain in just a minute here, and hear their insights about how they look at investing in projects. And so if any of you are thinking about creating a startup that is built on the blockchain, this would be a great way for you to learn about how an investor thinks about the world. So please stay tuned in. And Brian, thank you again. It was great having you.
It was great being here. Thank you very much.